Hi everyone. So I'm going to be unpacking one of the next generation science standards middle school standards. So why did I choose the next generation science standards? So these are the standards that the American International School of Conakry uses to inform its K through 12 science instruction, and they're what I use in my classroom right now. These content standards cover physical, life, earth and space sciences, as well as engineering topics. And they address key skills that any student or person would need to use in their day-to-day life, whether they're in the science field or another field. And these include communication, collaboration, and inquiry. So the standard that I chose is NGSS MS-LS2-4. And as you can see in the code here, the MS stands for middle school, and the LS stands for life science. And the 2 here refers to the standards that have to do with ecosystems. So I found that using the NGSS standards, most of the codes are pretty clear on uh, indicating which field of science and which grade level they are meant for. After middle school or starting at middle school, they don't split the standards into grades. It's just standards that need to be covered before the end of middle school and then standards that need to be covered before the end of high school. So they won't have sixth, seventh, eighth, and so on after fifth grade is over. The standard itself states students who demonstrate understanding can construct an argument supported by empirical evidence that changes to physical or biological components of an ecosystem affect populations. So, as with many science standards and NGSS standards, this standard has many different components and will lead to many different learning outcomes based on how it is unpacked. So the big ideas of this standard are about the changes to ecosystems resulting in changes in populations. And in the standard, it mentions physical changes. So these could be changes such as a temperature increase or decrease, a decrease or increase in precipitation, change in the landscape of the ecosystem. There's lots of different physical changes that could take place and could be learned about in a unit about this standard. There's also the biological changes. So these could be things such as the extinction of a native species in an ecosystem or the introduction of a new invasive species, and looking into how that would affect different species within the ecosystem. The skills of this standard are to construct an argument using empirical evidence. So that's the main skill that is mentioned here. And I think once you look at that skill, there's some things you can infer from that. So one thing that can be inferred is that you need to collect empirical evidence when you're covering this topic. So that means using the scientific method. So I would have students understand and practice the scientific method in order to fully incorporate all parts of this standard. I also would have students demonstrate that they are able to identify when a change in a population has occurred. So looking at data and saying, I notice that a change has occurred, and now I'm finding the cause of that change. So the first way that I would address the standard is through a PBL where students would be investigating the effects of physical conditions on yeast populations. So during this PBL, it's really thinking about the physical changes and not so much the biological changes. So students will be designing and carrying out an experiment and testing the impact of a physical condition change on a yeast population. And through this experimenting, they are going to be looking at temperature, pH, any physical change that they would like to look at, and seeing how the yeast population either increases or decreases or stays the same because of this condition. And their final product would be an explanation about their findings to a bakery, and they would just be giving them advice on the conditions they should keep their yeast populations in based on their experiment data. The second way that I would be addressing the standard would be through a research project on an invasive species. And since this is about an invasive species, it would be addressing a biological change in the system. So introducing a new species and showing how that would affect the native species of an ecosystem. So in this project, students would research the impact of this invasive species and see all the native species that it impacts. And then they would create a PSA to their school community, and they would be arguing these impacts to try to tell others in their school community what they can do about this invasive species and to reduce its impact on the species that they know in the local ecosystem.